Hi, Mark Rogerson here. We're going to have a look at today the disadvantages of buying a business and how to mitigate some of those risks. The first one I've got up here is what you're buying actual. That's a really big question. You pay a lot of money usually to try and work that out because what you're buying in a business is a future income stream. You're buying cash flow, and the biggest risk is that it's not going to transpire. So a lot of work needs to be done around that point. Secondly, can you maintain the business? And that sinks into, can you maintain your customer base once you take it over? And the customer base may actually be factual, but you come in as a new person. Did the old owner have a heap of key relationships with customers, with staff, with suppliers? Are you able to maintain, replicate, or even improve those relationships? And sometimes you're not going to know until you're actually in. Sure, you may have some contracts with customers, but sometimes, like you can appreciate, there's a change in the business and it might be the opportunity that customer's looking for to have a look around. Links into you. Are you the right person? Have you got experience in this industry or business before? What type of person are you? Are the people in the business going to complement you? Are you a similar person or different person to the previous owner? What does that mean? What does that matter? I think it's a real consideration, and it can be a disadvantage when buying a business because it's so central to you. Do you have the drive? Do you have the passion? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the skills? Can you actually do what you need to do? Have you overpaid for the business? Often you don't know until you get it. That sort of links to the first one under what you're buying is actual. If you're expecting a cash flow of 500,000 and it's only delivering 300,000, gee whiz, what does that mean? Does that mean you've paid too much? Are the assets and the plant and equipment and all that sort of stuff you've bought, sort of obsolete or near it or really old and not working, etc. So overpaying for a business is a really big worry, and people spend a lot of money trying to not overpay on a business. We'll talk about that in a minute. And debt and working capital. Buy a business, look, my opinion is often the more expensive the business is, the better it is. The larger the business, the better it is. You've got more protection. You're buying a small cafe in a shopping centre. Okay, it might be really cheap to get into it, but that's usually for a reason. If you're buying a business that's a bit more expensive and it's bigger, etc., and you need debt and whatnot, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a risk and it is a disadvantage. If you're in a position where you can not have to go to a bank, that may be good and that may suit, but it's something, it is a disadvantage. And working capital is the second thing, and often not understood. When you might buy a business where you look at a 12-month projection, and yes, it's going to generate these sorts of cash flows, but those cash flows won't be there day one. You've got to build up stock perhaps, or work in progress depending on your business. You've got to make sales, you've got to collect debts, and then in the meantime you've got to pay people. You've got to pay suppliers, you've got to pay staff, you've got to pay rent, you've got to pay overheads, etc. And often too, when you're jumping into a business to start with, even though that business may have had, or the entity you're buying, if you are buying the entity or the business you've purchased, may have had relationships and still existing relationships with suppliers. In most cases, the suppliers won't know you and they won't give you any credit terms. So your working capital is going to need to be a real consideration here, and how that gets funded. So moving over to how to mitigate some of these risks, and this by no means is an exhaustive list. This is obviously a 3 to 5 minute video, so it's pretty quick, and a lot more work and consideration needs to be done around this. But some of the ideas with how to mitigate a really detailed financial and legal due diligence. And that's especially if you're buying the entity. So that means, in Australia, if you're buying a company and you're buying the shares off the vendor, there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done on a financial and legal side to try and mitigate your risks. To make sure that what you're buying is actual and that you're not overpaying, but also from a legal point of view, what are your legal exposures if you do buy this entity. So that's sort of the first thing. The second one is do your homework, which sort of goes without saying, but do your homework on the industry. What sort of life cycle is the industry at? What's the competition like? How aggressive is the competition? What are you actually being chopped into here? What's the future of the industry? And that sort of links into disruption. Are you buying a blockbuster video outlet 3 months before Netflix hits Australia, for example? What are the risks? Do your research, try and mitigate those, try and understand the industry as best you can. And it does go without saying, because you're buying a business and you're naturally doing your homework. But these are perhaps some things to think about. Another way to mitigate your risks is to look at comparative sales. So if you're buying a particular business in a particular industry, it's likely that there's other types of businesses in that industry that sell. So have a look at what comparative sales are. Much like when you're buying a real estate property, you can hop onto a website and check what the one down the road went for, etc. Perhaps not that simple. You may need to talk to a few business brokers who specialise in the industry that you're in. But absolutely, comparative sales is a must, and you can work out then how the businesses are valued. You're making sure then you're mitigating your risk for not overpaying on the business. Using debt to involve a lender, I've sort of got debt over here and working capital as a bit of a risk or a sort of a bit of a watch out, but it may work to your advantage, or it may help mitigate some of the disadvantages when buying a business. And that is, when you're using debt, you need to involve a bank, and a bank has a whole lot of checks and processes and systems, etc. They may need a valuation done on the business. Even if you're not buying freehold, they may be able to do a valuation on that business. That can help just put your the business you're going to buy through another lens. So it can be a really useful tool to involve a lender. And I've got the last one, and certainly not least, and this list, like I said, is not exhaustive, but the last one here I've got is don't buy the entity unless you need to. So what I mean by that in Australia, for example, a business operating in a company, if you come in and buy the shares off the vendor, then you're buying the company and all the history with that company. It's typically not the preferred way. Probably 95% of transactions we see, it's when the actual business, being the goodwill, the plant and equipment, the IP, is purchased from an entity and then put into your fresh entity. Effectively, it hasn't had any historical trading. So that's usually what we see. Sometimes you can't get around that because there's key contracts with customers or suppliers, so that entity needs to be maintained, or that's sort of a really important part of what you're buying, and that's fine. It just means that this financial and legal due diligence needs to go up significantly. Okay, I hope that's been helpful. Thanks very much.